You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to ADHD BCE episode 6. So thanks for that, Kyle. I think now we'd like to talk a little bit about, obviously we're looking for neurodiversity or neurodivergence in the past, and we're looking for examples. Normally we go to archaeological sites or quotes or whatever, but right now I'd love just to talk about some of your displays, and perhaps if we could just follow on a little bit from what was mentioned in the previous section about, you obviously mentioned Aristotle's idea of exposing kids, which is a very nice way of saying let the poor things pass, which is just horrendous. And I feel quite disappointed, actually. I've got quite a soft spot for Greek philosophy, especially sort of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, but I'm going to have to rethink that now. With this episode, if we could look at maybe some of your displays and talk about examples of obviously disability, and if you can see neurodiversity or neurodivergence, and talk a little bit more broadly about the universal nature, because we often talk about the negatives a lot about humans, about pollution and war and all that lot, but actually we've got great capacity for empathy and compassion and care.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My displays that I've had the privilege of putting together so far. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I was previously the Curating for Change Fellow at the Ashmolean Museum and Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. Now, Curating for Change was a fellowship designed to give disabled, deaf and neurodivergent people the chance to work as curators in museums. And in that work, we looked at their museum collections with the partner museums to see if we could kind of highlight stories of disability. Now, in my role at the Ashmolean Museum and Pitt Rivers Museum, obviously I'm coming from my own archaeological background and archaeological knowledge and my kind of knowledge on looking at disability and antiquity. So I knew that the first challenge would be kind of looking at this material and really saying, well, where are the disability-focused stories? Now, on the Ashmolean Museum side, I had the benefit there because a lot of the material I'd worked with there, particularly the pre-dynastic figurines and artworks from what's known as the Hierakonpolis main deposit, was the subject of my master's thesis. Therefore, I was able to work with that quite easily. I already knew what I was going to say there, particularly as, again, artworks tend to obviously give us a view of the body, and that body can show differences. But bringing it to neurodiversity, and where I think, our approaches to this in archaeology and in wider society will only be benefited from when we start to include those with the lived experience of neurodiversity to really bring that perspective, is when I was doing my work at the Pitt Rivers Museum. For any who haven't had the privilege and the joy of visiting the Pitt Rivers Museum yet, it is what we call a typological museum. That means that instead of the collections being categorized by, we have Africa here and Asia here, or we have ancient Egypt here and ancient Rome over there, you instead have all of these different objects organized by a type. So in one case, you might have an entire dedication towards the human form in art or towards medication, and they can come from all over the world, and they are just arranged together in almost a kind of little smorgasbord kind of way, almost akin to what early museums were known to be as cabinets of curiosities. It's a bit more contemporary than that now, but it still captures that same aesthetic in some ways. And what that meant was, at first, quite a challenge, because then you're thinking, well, how do I intervene into something like this to really say disability stories? Except one of my good kind of peers from the University of Sydney, Lauren Poole, once said in a talk that she gave that any object can be a disability object if you look at it through the right lens, because we all bring our own unique lenses to our work. That's inherent in what we do. To say that there is any true objectivity when looking at an object or a person or a part of history is objectively false, ironically enough. Like, we are all subjective creatures, and that subjectivity is what's good because it allows us to approach things with a more multivocal voice. So as part of the work that I did, we focused on a bit of co-production with local disabled people from around the Oxford area. And within that group, I wanted to ensure that we could have as decent a spread as we could of various different embodiments of disability. And that included many different people who were neurodivergent in one way or another. So when it came to looking at the space and thinking about the themes that we wanted to talk on, we focused on three distinct themes. We looked at form and function, so how the body and mind have been perceived over time and how that is represented in the objects that are on display. We thought about precarity and violence, thinking about why is it that people are made disabled by violence, but also how disabled people are then put into precarious situations, but fundamentally what happens to the person who's put in that situation, because we didn't just want to focus on the victim in the moment, we wanted to think about them as a person after the fact, because of course any victim is still very much a person after the fact and has that journey afterwards. And then lastly, but most importantly, we also wanted to emphasize care, because we wanted to bring back to, as you were just saying, this universal idea of care that has existed in human cultures and how that is expressed in the collections and how disabled people bring a unique perspective on care. And so just to highlight one or two examples quickly of where neurodivergence kind of helped to really redress some of these objects and really look at them in a different light. For example, we had one co-producer who has what is commonly still known as Asperger's syndrome. There is a move away from that term, but he chose to still describe himself as Asperger's syndrome because that was the term that he was given when he was a young lad. He's now in his 50s, and he recognizes why there's a move away from that, because of course Hans Asperger's was complicit with the Nazis, but he still goes by that label, and so it's what forms part of his identity. Anyway, he also has experienced complex PTSD. And so in the combination of those things, he really wanted to express how he's come to kind of reconcile with those things and make sense of them based on his own traumas and experiences. And so he made a connection with an ancient Egyptian heart scarab. An ancient Egyptian heart scarab was used by the deceased to function as their heart to be weighed against the feather of truth to see if they were worthy of living in the next life, in the life beyond. And he connected with that because we, in the process of co-production, had a really lovely conversation as a group about that, and about, because he wasn't the only one who was part of the group who had those experiences of complex PTSD. And I relayed to them the story of the discourse between a man and his bar. And this is a story written in what is known as the Middle Kingdom period, so around the kind of second millennium BCE, going into the beginnings of the first millennium BCE. And this is really thinking that the right way. Yes, second millennium BCE to the first millennium BCE. This is a story where a man is having a discourse with himself, with his bar, or sometimes his heart, because in the Egyptian kind of view of their own body minds, the heart was the center of the mind. He's basically having a discussion with his own heart about the meaning of pain and suffering, and asking what the point of life is, because he's living in a time of constant change and flux and uncertainty, and he's just not sure. It's not so much suicidal ideation as it is just kind of coming to terms with why he's experiencing all the things that he's experiencing and what the point of it all is. And this co-producer just really connected with that and said, well, that's exactly how I feel when I'm thinking about my neurodivergence and my complex PTSD. Is this all in my mind, or is this something that is part of life? Is this part of the everyday sense of things? And how he feels that both physically, all these different kind of pressure points in his body when he's having a anxiety attack, and also then when he dreams, and he dreams of these scenarios that are difficult for him and cause him to kind of have that anxious moment, that those aren't just inherent to his mind, but those are something that he feels. And it was a very raw kind of story to share in the museum context, because often we're used to the idea of the museum label being this very objective thing, again, this idea of objectivity, how subjective that is. But it really resonated with our audiences. People stopped and they really thought, and they said, wow, I would never really think about that with this object, because the heart scarab doesn't just encapsulate that kind of function that it had as a kind of item, as an offering, but also kind of encapsulates these deeper feelings that the ancient Egyptians were having about the meaning of their heart and all the things that it held, their personal thoughts and feelings, and then bringing that into the contemporary, how we deal with our personal thoughts and feelings.
Just want to go back really quickly to that ancient Egyptian poem you mentioned. One thing I always like to think about with this, when we talk about, the Egyptians believed that the heart was the center of the mind. Well, they didn't do it like that by chopping open bodies and piecing it all together. It was a lived experience. It was how you feel emotional. Maybe you that push and pull between your heart and your mind. In ancient Egypt, they rightly or wrongly put more emphasis on the heart, and I love the fact that the guy helping you out on your display was inspired to think about the life and death and why he's here, and for me that really shows not necessarily a neurodivergent trait, but it shows a busy, intelligent mind, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of these things where, human beings as a species, we are a very reflective creature. We're very introspective at times as well. We can't help but stop and wonder at the wider questions, the things that we can't really grasp and explain just by sense and touch alone. We kind of have to sit there and reflect. And that can be overbearing at times, but it can equally at times be inspiring and enriching. And the nature of the story of the discourse between the man and his bar, like in the past, it's sometimes been kind of inferred as a discourse on suicide. But again, that's not what it's about. It's a wider dialectical question about, what it means to be human and the meaning of pain and suffering in that equation, and how we make sense of all that, and how we make sense of it in the midst of an uncertain time. And that's something that humans across history have had to deal with. And the fact that you can go this far back and see it there is a reminder that we have always been dealing with it, and that it's an open question to really reflect more. And the fact that in the contemporary sense, my co-producers could make a connection with it then with their own experiences of neurodivergence and complex PTSD is really vital. And especially, just to go back to what you were saying about how the ancient Egyptians kind of perceived the heart as the center of the mind, they did this based on their own kind of embodied sense of themselves as well. It wasn't just purely a superstitious thing. Like in their medical papyri, which were quite extensive, and we only have fragments today, but in what's known as Papyrus Ebers, which deals with all sorts of ailments, the way that Egyptians would write about medical conditions is they would kind of write a diagnosis or prognosis of them, and then they would write about their treatments and the ways in which they would be observed, yada, yada, yada. And they would keep these records for future doctors to refer back to obviously think about their own treatments. When it comes to the heart, there is a book, or a section rather, of Papyrus Ebers that's sometimes singled out as being about the rhythms of the heart. And this can be inferred either as to talk about the cardiovascular system and what they knew of it based on embalming and based on treatments for people with infections and stuff like that. However, there are also within the text talkings about the kind of various temperaments of the heart. And when I say temperaments, what I mean is how it felt when they were having what we might call a panic attack. What they might have felt when they were experiencing a flush of excitement or a kind of sort of buzz, and those sorts of things. So there is a very clear understanding and attunement, even if not exactly in the ways that we would think today, about how our kind of mental well-being affects our physical well-being and the connections between the two. And that's why they may have had this idea of the heart as being its own living thing with the soul inside. Because there are even stories which refer to, oh, my heart caused me to flee, or my heart caused me to go into a flight. So this body mind, as we would call it today, I believe the term was coined by Dr. Sami Schalk. We're talking about the idea of the body and mind not as separate things, as separate conditions, but something that are intertwined. It may not have been coined by Dr. Sami Schalk, but it's where I first encountered it. Here, Dr. Sami Schalk is a prominent disability activist and scholar in the United States, wrote Black Disability Politics, the book. Anyway, my point is that this is something that is inherent to the human condition, that there's our feelings and thoughts and attitudes that have been dealt with for a very long time. And even if we can't necessarily pinpoint exact instances of neurodivergence, by allowing that lived experience to come through in our analysis, to allow that subjectivity, to look at the historical record and say, well, here's something that I can relate to, here's something that I can really see my kind of worldview come into play through my embodied experience of neurodivergence gives us the possibility of, while we can't say with any certainty that that was necessarily a neurodivergent trait, as you were saying, it does allow us to see how neurodivergence has its role to play in the wider development of people's perceptions of the world. And this comes into various things like society and the development of power structures, but also in ritual as well. If I can, just very quickly, I want to touch upon how in my current display, another one of my co-producers who's also neurodivergent, the display I've been working on, to give some context, is for looking at disability, health and disability in the Roman world at the Verulamium Museum. They looked at temple rituals and how they, as a neurodivergent person, live by rituals. They do that every single day. Having a repeated action is a way to give themselves some structure and rhythm that keeps them calm and keeps them happy. And so when they were thinking about temple rituals in the Roman world, which are obviously a big part of people's daily life, and if you think about even household gods and the rituals that would go around those are very important rituals. And so would someone who is neurodivergent or autistic and really function on the basis of rituals really have stood out in the Roman world, or would they have been right at home? That's the fun question that they're posing in their labels.
I love that.
Just to consider those possibilities all of a sudden gets you to realize, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Carl, we're just going to have one last quick break and then we'll come back to talk some more about this. Okay, Carl, so we've probably got about 10 minutes. So if we can do one thing, I'd just look, because I know you're a chat bag like me. You're just going to keep talking. So we're going to go off in all sorts of directions. So just to add a little bit of structure, if we can just talk a little bit about, something I'm desperate to talk with you about is identifying neurodiversity or neurodivergent traits in the past. There's tons we could talk about outside of that, but if we could aim to sort of sail the ship down that channel.
Absolutely. I think like I was hopefully illustrating with those examples that I gave of my co-producers' work on the displays that I've done, I don't think we could ever really get anywhere near close to beginning to think about neurodivergence in the past without including neurodivergent people and writing and theories in that work. And this is where, archaeology as a discipline more broadly really has to kind of bring in more from what is often referred to as disability studies or critical disability studies to start to think about how those body minds really start to influence not just human behavior and thoughts and processes, but also just the human experience, that ontological experience, ontology being the experiences of the body and the mind. And I think when thinking about neurodivergence specifically and looking for it in the past, I think it could start by really taking a closer reading to a lot of those kind of bits of literature, that some of which we've already talked about, and thinking about where a neurodivergent reading of those sources could. It's not necessarily about saying whether the authors themselves or any particular person they're talking about was or wasn't neurodivergent. It's more about thinking about, well, how could the experience of neurodivergence have influenced kind of societal behavior or a person's behavior in this sort of way. So, for example, I'm just going to spitball here. How would a reading of Cicero change if we considered the possibility that he may have been a little bit neurodivergent? I'm not saying whether he could or couldn't have been. I don't think we'll ever know, and that's not the point. The point is, how do we think differently if we consider the possibility that our authors, our interlocutors that we engage with, weren't just that standard neurotypical one body, one mind sort of person that we are kind of, again, as we were talking about earlier, engineered to assume that we all must be. Yeah, when in reality, people in the past were just as diverse, just as different as we are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all I was going to say, actually, Carl. Yeah, I wanted to make that point. Yeah, no, carry on.
No, it's okay. And so, I think by expanding the discipline, making it more inclusive and giving this opportunity for us to read the past, both literature, but also objects in a different way, again, it just brings a different way of appreciating how things may have been done. I mean, I spoke to a gentleman named Charlie Hales, who is a classics teacher in the UK, who's also neurodivergent. There's a great group, by the way, called Asterion, which is for neurodiversity in the classics, which you may have already heard of.
Sadly, no. I'll have to put that one in the show notes. You have to send me that.
Look them up, get in touch. I mean, they're a wonderful bunch, and many neurodivergent classicists are there. But it's about like kind of reading those sources and thinking about them again in this different context. And in particular, I would say, along with kind of literature that's written by scholars who are obviously commenting on their present at the time, so people like Cicero again, or Aristotle, as we mentioned earlier, or any of the philosophers, there's also thinking about kind of their narrative literature and what that might tell us. Because the thing about things like myth and legend and epics like that is they are very much a reflection on the human condition. Obviously to exaggerated proportions, but they do feature elements of that. And so a lot of what is written about in terms of kind of the broader term of kind of the mind and disability in the ancient past obviously looks at a lot of these myths and thinks about what they could be saying about those in a kind of more subtextual way. So, for example, you think of stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which, you know, if we really boil them down, and of course they are a multitude of things, but if you really boil them down, the Iliad is a story about rage. And sorrow, and the Odyssey is about the almost the repercussions of that, the long journey home, which is both literally Odysseus's long journey, but also the journey that he is having to take as someone who has just endured a hell of a lot and continues to endure more. And those readings and those kind of reception studies, if you will, can really be enriched, I think, by considering a neurodivergent take on these things in much the same way as we can think about how, say, for example, the Greek god Hephaestus, who of course has his physical embodiment of disability with his clubbed foot, but also his role as an inventor, as a creator, as a problem solver, could also be a reflection of the ancients' recognition of people who have these physical embodiments can also have these kind of very capable problem-solving capabilities. That's my personal take on why Hephaestus has his physical impairment, because the ancients would have recognized that people with physical disabilities quite often had to come up with their own solutions, but that could also equally be true when considering how neurodivergent people quite often take on in their day-to-day, and therefore are also seen quite irregularly as problem solvers, as managers, as multitaskers. So maybe that has something to do with it, and that also comes in, and this is again where thinking about disability in an intersectional way even further increases the possibility. Like, you know, in those same stories I mentioned, the Iliad and Odyssey, there is obviously the recurring kind of female characters, the witches and the powerful women who are kind of somewhat kind of held tentatively at arm's length, like, oh, I'm not sure about this one. How that could also be, you know, thinking about the experience of neurodivergent women and how neurodivergence is experienced differently across gender lines and gender kind of norms, and how that plays not only in the contemporary, but again, thinking about in the past, how women were perceived in the past and where neurodivergence might come in there. And therefore, if there is a sort of neurodivergent attunement with characters like Circe, for example, or I could go on, but my point is again, is not saying definitively, it's not about saying, oh, this person is neurodivergent or this character is neurodivergent. It's about how a neurodivergent lens can give us a new reading of these things, and therefore might reflect ancient kind of recognition of these conditions in the past, if not by obviously how we categorize them today, but then by how they are expressed and how they are felt. And then that again also helps us when thinking about it from a non-fiction author's perspective, how those things may have influenced, if not their decisions and their actions, but then maybe the sorts of people that they interacted with when they refer to characters who were seen as kind of quirky or different. You know, it just multiplies the possibilities and creates a more colorful picture, I think, and that's ultimately to the benefit of our understanding of the past and our understanding of ourselves, because that's where I would really like to conclude, is just to say that the point of doing all of this is that it's not about saying, oh, this person is neurodivergent now, this person is disabled now, therefore all their hours go away, normies. It's about saying that it's about saying that life is much more multifaceted than just, oh, they were a great warrior or great statesman or philosopher, and they lived and they died and this is what they said and that's the end of it. It's like, well, they lived through a worlds that were in their time, always changing, always developing, as we do today. And their embodied experience of themselves would have played a role in how they felt and how they feel. And it's recognizing that possibility that allows us to appreciate that it's for all those reasons that humanity has been able to get as far as it has, by embracing that kind of broad range of differences, that broad range of opinions that helps to inform how we have chosen to live as a society. And that it's only by continuing to accept that broad approach and those broad divergences that we will ever be able to make it any further. And that's the tension that I feel like underlies our present, is that we are living in a world that is constrained by this idea of the way that things ought to be done. And unfortunately, not to get on my soapbox, but I think we are all starting to feel that the ways in which we've been told things ought to be done are not working.
Yeah.
And so the only way to move forward is to bring in newer ideas and different ways of ideas. And that can only be achieved by including the voices that have up to this point continually been suppressed. And that is, again, a broad church of different types of people that are intersected together. But in terms of disability, I think it's about showing that it is not about deficiency, it is not about the other. I really despise the phrase the forgotten other. I realize why it gets used, but I hate it, because forgotten by who and whose other? You know, I think yeah. Actually, when you think about it, disability has been at the very crux of what humanity is, because it is a condition that you can either be born with, or a condition that can be kind of brought about either by incident or by intention.
Yeah.
And by actually starting to understand that and how it affects us, we can begin to ask deeper questions of ourselves and understand that none of this, again, society at large, could have been possible without people like us.
Absolutely.
And that's where I want to end.
Kyle, that's absolutely fantastic. I think if I could just add to that, drawing on what you've been saying there. If we hark back to what we were talking about with the Great Incarceration, and we're talking about prejudice, and we're here with you say, get on that soapbox and live on that soapbox, Kyle. Don't apologise for doing that. That's fine. It needs to be done for those reasons, for the negative reasons, for fighting back reasons, essentially, for our own sanity, for our own peace of mind and our own sense of pride. But also what you get with it, you get a better perspective. I think we limit ourselves when we try to be neurotypical, or we try to create these cultures that are monochronistic and everybody born, lives, dies in the same way. It doesn't work. That's not who we are. The universe is chaos. No. Human beings are chaos. We're supposed to have the differences. We're supposed to be the way we are. And when we discover that, when we really look into it, when we find the colour, we find the richness, and we look at archaeology through those lenses, it's a different world. It's not avatars, it's not neurotypical, it's not boring, it's incredible. And I think that's one of the great things that you do with your work, your displays especially, is highlight the differences that until recently have been completely ignored.
Well, that's what I hope to do, and that's what I'm going to keep doing, I think. And I want to kind of almost capture the imagination that way, and just again remind people, especially those who have been otherwise ignored or misunderstood in the contemporary present, that this world has always been theirs and it always will be. We were there at the very beginning and we'll be there at the very end, because fundamentally there's nothing more human than us.
Perfect. Kyle, thank you so much for coming on. We are going to have to do this again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
No worries, Kyle. We'll see you soon. Thanks very much.
See you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.